'Tis sorrow enough on that visage to gaze, that body dismissed from his care, yet my fancy has pierced to his heart and portrays more terrible images there. Welcome to Sunday Morning Poetry. Today we are going to read William Wordsworth's The Convict. Now this was a poem in 1798 that of all the lyrical ballads was probably the most lambasted, the most negatively reviewed, even by good friends of Wordsworth like Southey. They attacked this poem. They attacked it thematically as well as, its poetic merits. Now, of course, it has come to, like many of Wordsworth's work, come to be a great poem and considered a great poem. And in fact, in America, it was definitely considered a great poem. It was included in an 1802 version of Lyrical Ballads, even though Wordsworth himself removed it from the 1800 version that he released a couple years after the 1798 version. Now, why such teetering by Wordsworth on this? Why removing it, including it? It was actually first published in 1797 in the Post, a newspaper in England. What is it about this particular poem? And it has such resonating, important themes for us to talk about. Now, I recommend, if you're interested, if you like this poem, I'll recommend this now. Read or go to troubadourmag.com and look up The Dungeon by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, also in the 1798 Lyrical Ballads, and The Foster Mother's Tale by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. These are all poems that are about penal reform, reforming the justice, the punishment system. So, to get us started, I wanted to give you a quick little synopsis of the poem and then a little bit of background. I think that's a little conceptual thinking about this. So the poem is a visitor goes to a jail cell and he sees a convict and all the horror and death of, the living of that convict and what it's like being that convict. And then, of course, I'm not going to say what, but it's framed with, leaving nature and going into this prison cell, which represents death and misery and suffering and the crushing of the human spirit versus life that's outside of that. And then something very interesting that the narrator says at the end, which I won't tell you yet. I'll wait till you'll hear it. But there is a really interesting question about, the penal system. There are several interesting questions. There in a society, it's clear to any rational man that you need a penal system, you need a court system, you need a punishment system of some sort, or some kind of way to remove elements, individuals in society who break the laws of the society, especially when there's, certain procedures put in place that if you do this, there's going to be a fine. If you do this twice, there's going to be a bigger fine. If you do this 3 times, you're going to be put into a jail for 6 months. If we release you, you do it again, you're going to get a 3, there's got to be this some kind of system. And that makes sense. And it has to happen because, especially when you're talking about like violence and robbery and things of that nature, one, there needs to be some kind of attempt at restitution if it's, a robbery of some sort, but also if it's a violent crime, you want to make sure that, justice is served not only to the person who was assaulted, right? So in a savage society, if you hit me with something and rob me, I'm going to come at you with an axe. Like that's how they used to do it. All right. Or my family will. And there was this rivalry between families, and that was blood feuds were all over the place in the ancient world. And and through a lot of the histories. And what a good court system does is it removes that necessity. And it says, no, Kirk, you cannot go with an axe after that person. Neither can your family. But we will take care of the justice and meting out that justice so you don't need to. And in fact, you're not allowed to. If you do it, you'll also go to prison. And you'll be, the justice is blind. Violence is what we're against. So you got to stop doing that. And that makes sense. And so you got to rely on the court systems to act properly to imprison these people and to to met out justice. But also a practical aspect of that is that that person no longer can hurt other people. So if they hurt me and they robbed me, they beat me up and took my money, well, they go to jail, and now they are no longer able to beat up free people anyway. They can maybe do that in prison, and which is why you don't want to go to prison. But and so they can no longer do that in the free society and beat up another person and take their money, or maybe even worse, kill somebody and take their money. So this is a righteous thing that we need to have. And we need to be, in my view, we need to have a strict semblance of laws that really lay down on this. But there's a lot of important questions that are really tricky. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer them, but I do read a lot of poetry. And so what we can get from the poetic side of things is asking deep philosophical questions or deep poetic questions about the inner soul of a human. So for instance, let's say that person does beat me up and they go to jail. Should we kill them? I mean, what if they don't reform? How do we know that they reform, right? Like, if we let's say they get 5 years. Okay, that seems like a pretty extreme for beating, depending on how severely they beat me up. If it's near death, then maybe it would be, elevated. The accusation might be elevated to something like attempted manslaughter, attempted murder. Okay, so then maybe they get 10, 15 years. Okay, so he's 20 years old now. He's 35. When he gets out, is he necessarily reformed? What if he gets back into crime again? We don't know, right? And then now I want to tell a real life modern story about this. So in a recent story, it has just occurred. Hundreds of Oklahoma inmates being released Monday in America, in largest commutation in U.S. history. Now, what was interesting to me is, actually I tried to have an exchange with someone on Facebook, someone on the right, more on the right, when it comes to penal reform, about this whole situation. Because what the law is going on, and this is happening around November 6th or 5th, I believe. And today I'm recording this on November 8th. You're probably hearing this much later than November 8th, 2019. But when I first read this, the thing that struck me was that who is being released are supposedly non-violent drug holders. That's the biggest people being released, the biggest part of the population being released. Now, for me, that is really important. I do not think you should be going to prison or jail or anything. I don't think you should even have a fine. I think it should be perfectly legal. You should be at liberty to, do whatever drugs to your own body that you want to be doing, right? And I think that the justice system is very flawed right now, because it's particularly because of these drug laws are convoluting everything, and they're causing, and they even cause violent crimes by having them. But even if you don't agree with that, what we can look at is the nonviolent, crimes that are happening, and the claim that they're nonviolent. Now, when I had this exchange, I can't call it a conversation because there was no listening to at least my side. Like I tried to cede some points to the other person, and they just didn't want to hear what I was saying. And they wanted to just say, well, this is how crime increases. And we have, if we do this, I promise you, we're going to have an increase in crime. And it's like, okay. So I think we can talk about that. And that's definitely a problem. I don't want an increase in crime. Like it seems like that's what he assumes that I want, or something like that. And that I only care about what the prisoners are going through, and even if they're violent criminals. But I was going off what the article is about, which is about nonviolent people. When I looked at some of the individual cases, they were people who were just accused of drug possession. I don't think you should go to jail for that. Now, if you want to make an argument on a separate argument somewhere else that, hey, we're not like the people who are getting drug possession, that's only because that's the only way we can get that person. For whatever reason, we're not able to get them for a violent crime, right? Even though they committed violent crimes. That's kind of the claim this other individual on Facebook was making. It's not just a random person. He's a established, smart, published author. So it's, but it was interesting to me that this individual was so focused on the societal implications of something like this. And they were implications that I agreed with, but he was completely incapable of listening to what I was trying to, explicate in terms of the individuals who genuinely were going into this with nonviolent crimes and what their experience was like. So that's what I was trying to get to. And, that has a lot to do with the poem we're going to be reading, except the poem's going to make a more extreme argument. I'm making a very mild, modern argument. This poem that we're about to read is going to make an extreme argument. But the reason I want to bring all this up is that one of the things that was interesting to me in this exchange was how my interlocutor, or the exchange person that, I was hoping to have a conversation with, but could not, that one of the things, we came to, or I came to discover, was that there was not a focus at all, or even seemingly a care about the possibility of nonviolent people genuinely being in prison. The focus was always, and I saw this with many other commenters that agreed with the other person, was that the focus was always on the societal impacts of this kind of law, which I agree is a problem. We can't be lax on law. And I agreed with that multiple times. I said, yeah, we got to have strict laws. We got to have better court systems that get the laws and enforce the laws. We have to have punishments for those. Like I'm all for that for violent crimes. But I was saying but there are people that are getting in prison for nonviolent crimes. That they literally just possessed drugs. And there are people like that. You could argue, you cannot argue that they're not, because there's lots of evidence of people who simply had drugs on them. They have nothing else on their record. There's nothing else going on, and they do go to prison. Now, some people will argue there's more, or there's much less of that than, and like there's the numbers I saw was something like on the right, the political right, people that might agree with that might say something like, well, there's only 16%, and on the left it's more like, oh, there's 58% of nonviolent, or 68. And it's like, okay, so one, I'm not interested in stats, I'm interested in individuals. But let's say we take the 16%. Okay, well, that's 16%. If we, are on the right and we're talking about these are genuinely people who aren't, criminals, or they're not violent criminals. In fact, I don't even think they're criminals, because they just possess drugs, which shouldn't go to jail for. But let's say that it's only 16, let's say it's only 10%. That's still like, there's like 3 million people in prison, or whatever number we want to go off of. That's still thousands of people, individuals who are in prison who should not be in prison. And so that's what I was focused on. That was my focus. The other person's focus was society is going to be destroyed. We're all going to be, subjected to criminal behavior or crime. And, it's like I agreed with both, but the interesting thing to me is that the other person was refusing to even acknowledge or look at the individual lives of somebody who's punished for a nonviolent crime. Now, what is the point of all that I just talked about with this crime? The point is that when we're talking about penal reform, and we're talking about what's actually happening to criminals, convicts, in the case of William Wordsworth, we have to ask, there's a punishment side where, yes, you broke the law, so there's a punishment. But then there's the question of actual reform. Like, can we reform somebody? And if not, what do we do with that person? Right. So think about someone who does who's multiple, doesn't kill anybody, but multiple assaults. Like, he was a violent person. He goes to prison, he comes back out, he's still a violent person. Like, so what do you do with someone like that? Do you just kill them? Should we bring back execution on a much broader scale and just execute? Should we throw them in a hole forever? Is that it? And are they completely done? And then, of course, on the less mild side, or on the mild side, I mean, what do you do with someone who is a thief, right? So obviously they need to be punished, but do we just kill them? What if they are a thief again, right? Do we just kill them and say, well, we can't let you out because you're going to do it again anyway. This is your third time, so we're going to kill you. It's like, well, so this issue of like, what do you do with the prisoners? And there's a lot of cases like this where it's like they just keep going back into the phrase is a life of crime. Now, this individual that I was talking to on the right seems to have no pathos or even thought about criminals. Like, he doesn't even want to think about the value that a criminal might have. Like, let's say he broke a law, right? When he was 18 or something, and he makes some mistakes and they give him some lenience, and he comes back at 22 and he does it again, and then he's going to go into jail for 20 years or something like that because he assaulted someone severely. Or, I don't know, the issue of there's a lot of different cases that we can look at, but the question is, can we look at convicts as humans? Should we do that? So the people that were looking at Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads said no, basically. They said this kind of penal reform would lead to chaos and murder and death in the streets. Whereas Wordsworth and Coleridge are arguing that they thought it's possible, along with the philosopher that they liked, Samuel Godwin, Mary Shelley's father, they thought it was possible to reform certain criminals, or that reform was possible. And they thought that there were ways to do it that were better than what we're doing. And they thought that it was worthwhile to consider it, to go into the life of a convict and as they're, when they're in prison, and the life of prison and what we can do. Now, I'm not claiming, and they're not claiming either, that they have the judicial answers to all this. That's not the role of a poet. The role of a poet is to help you see better, to help you do the thing you don't want to do. So I would call out this interlocutor on Facebook and say, even if you hate all of these individuals, if you want to challenge your soul, go into the life of one of these individuals once. Like, really go into it. Empathize. Look at the pathos, not just of, the argument I always hear on the right is that what I'm saying now is trying to defend all of their actions and their behaviors and their criminal actions as, oh, society did it, so it's not their fault. I'm not saying it's not the convict's fault. I believe in free will, and I believe that they, did something wrong and they should be punished for it. What I'm saying is you need to understand, and it will be challenging to you, but it's something that you need to go into and look at as a part of the human experience on earth, that this convict made these decisions. And especially, and if you can see the humanity that still remains, I think it will teach you something about man and about humanity. And that is what Wordsworth is arguing. And that's what we're going to read. So I know that was a long introduction, but I hope that really sets up the kind of overview thematic ideas going on in the convict and in the Coleridge poems I told you about, the Dungeon and the Foster Mother's Tale, and what they're really focused on in terms of the particularly, I think, the reform of really, I think they're more extreme than I would be. I don't agree with everything they say, by the way, but that they're interested in the reform and the ability to reform convicts. Okay, so let's look at this poem, The Convict. I'll read it. It's not super long, but it's not like 5 stanzas. I think it's something like, it's 17 stanzas, but they're very short 4-line stanzas. So it's not super long. Okay, so let's take a look at this guy. Let me get this. So if you're on Facebook, you can see the text itself. And, or if you're on YouTube, or if you go to troubadourmag.com, you'll see the text. Otherwise, as usual, I will try to read slowly and articulate so that if you're just listening, I want the words to kind of wash over your soul. And it's not going to make the words you're going to know. There's only a few words you may not know. Like there's a line about halfway or toward the middle, yeah, where it says, "When from the dark synod or blood-reeking field." Synod, S-Y-N-O-D, means ecclesiastic, basically like church members and the church, services and things like that. We'll talk a little bit about what it's like, an ecclesiastic council. And we'll talk a little bit about the meaning of that and what they're going through. But try to just enjoy the language. There's some really pretty language that's actually being used here. And I'll point some of it out so you can hopefully see things a little bit better. Okay. The Convict by William Wordsworth. The glory of the evening was spread through the west. On the slope of a mountain I stood, while the joy that precedes the calm season of rest rang loud through the meadow and wood. And must we then part from a dwelling so fair? In the pain of my spirit I said, and with a deep sadness I turned to repair to the cell where the convict is laid. The thick-ribbed walls that o'ershadow the gate resound, and the dungeons unfold. I pause, and at length through the glimmering gate great that outcast of pity behold. His black-matted head on his shoulder is bent, and deep is the sigh of his breath, and with steadfast dejection his eyes are intent on the fetters that link him to death. 'Tis sorrow enough on that visage to gaze, that body dismissed from his care, yet my fancy has pierced to his heart, and portrays more terrible images there. His bones are consumed, and his lifeblood is dried, with wishes the past to undo, and his crime, through the pains that overwhelm him, descried, still blackens and grows on his view. When from the dark synod, or blood-reeking field, to his chamber the monarch is led, all soothers of sense their soft virtue shall yield, and quietness pillow his head. But if grief, self-consumed in oblivion, would doze, and conscience her tortures appease, mid tumult and uproar this man must repose in the comfortless vault of disease. When his fetters at night have so pressed on his limbs that the weight can no longer be borne, if, while a half-slumber his memory bedims, the wretch on his pallet should turn, while the jail mastiff howls at the dull clanking chain, from the roots of his hair there shall start 1,000 sharp punctures of cold sweating pain, and terror shall leap at his heart. But now he half raises his deep sunken eye, and the motion unsettles a tear. The silence of sorrow it seems to supply, and asks of me why I am here. Poor victim! No idle intruder has stood with o'erweening complacence our state to compare, but one whose first wish is the wish to be good, is come as a brother thy sorrows to share. At thy name through compassion her nature resign, though in virtue's proud mouth thy report be a stain, my care, if the arm of the mighty were mine, would plant thee where yet thou mightst blossom again. I'm going to read that last stanza again. I kind of messed up. So this is the last stanza. At thy name, though compassion her nature resign, though in virtue's proud mouth. Let me try one more time. At thy name, though compassion her nature resign, though in virtue's proud mouth thy report be a stain, my care, if the arm of the mighty were mine, would plant thee where yet thou mightst blossom again. Okay, there we go. I got it. I don't edit these, so I actually am doing these pretty much live with one recording. So sometimes I make mistakes. Okay, which is interesting that the mistake happened there. I don't, it happened to me there before, and I wonder, I have to look at the meter a little bit more closely, but I think there might be a change in the way he's using words in such a way that it does kind of stumble in your mouth a little bit, and it kind of forces you to look at it more when something like that happens. Or I just made a mistake. Okay, so let's go through this a little bit. So the convict, it opens with a description of the location of the jail, or somewhere in the area, like maybe the person's taking a break and they're on a mountainside, and you can see the calm joy of the end of the fall, which rings through meadow and wood. So, the glory of the evening was spread through the west. On the slope of a mountain I stood, while the joy that precedes the calm season of rest. Well, what's the season of rest? Season of rest is probably winter, right? So we're talking about the end of fall. So there's a joy that comes before the winter, and that's ringing through the meadow and wood. And so there's kind of like, this is life. There's a season of rest, right? It's the calmness of life that's going on, and there's a joy that it brings. And, he's talking about that life. And then the narrator says, quote, "And must we then part from a dwelling so fair?" So now he has to go visit this jail cell for some reason. "In the pain of my spirit, I said, and with a deep sadness I turned to repair to the cell where the convict is laid." Now, why does he have to go there? It's not really clear. The word repair might be a little confusing. I don't think it means he's going to go do repairs. I think he's actually although it might be that. You could take it that way and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But I think in the 18th century, there were many stories of that were in novels, but also people that would go into jail cells just to kind of gawk, and madhouses to kind of gawk, and almost like a zoo, look at all the people, look at all the scum of the earth. And they would just kind of laugh and point and gawk at them. And so he's trying to, Wordsworth is trying to distance himself from that, but this individual is the narrator in his poem is there to look at this person for some reason. Now we find out there is a particular reason he claims at the end, but it's just an interesting thinking about the narrator's motivations. And it helps us understand, I think, the overall poem, what it's trying to say about the penal system and the society at large. Now in these first two stanzas, what we're hearing is the narrator saying, why do we have to go into this place where the convict is laid? So there's kind of an inclination that maybe the convict could be out here, right? Why does he have to be in this gloom? And here's the next stanza. What is the gloom? It's the thick ribbed walls that o'ershadow the gate resound. Even that word, the gate resound, like you can kind of hear the gate going boom, with the kind of finality of the gates of hell and death, and the dungeons unfold, right? The dungeon of this place of torture. I pause, and at length, through the glimmering gate grate, the outcast of pity behold. So he's beholding the outcast of pity. And that's an interesting statement in and of itself, right? What does it mean to be an outcast of pity? An outcast of pity. So, he's not capable of being pitied, really. It's not just like, he's an object of pity. He's an outcast of pity. So he's even beyond being pitied anymore. He's beyond the realm of pathos. He's beyond the realm of most people, thinking about him as a human. Now, Wordsworth is going to make the argument that he is a human, though, that behind the convict, just like behind the doctor and behind the lawyer and the farmer and the king, behind every, staple that society, every moniker that society puts on you, there is a man behind there. There's a human soul. And that's what he's interested in. The individual, right? And what's going on in that individual's soul. His black matted head on his shoulder is bent. So you can see, like, it's very visual. His head is probably grimy and dirty and hasn't been washed in months or years. And is kind of drooping on his shoulder. And deep is the sigh of his breath, right? And you can picture like just like this deep breathing of a convict, a dying convict. And with steadfast dejection, right? He's used to this kind of dejection. His eyes are intent on the fetters that link him to death. So we have totally left the calm joy of the season of rest. And we are now in the valley of the shadow of death, or really the valley of death. Next stanza. 'Tis sorrow enough on that visage to gaze, that body dismissed from his care. Yet my fancy has pierced to his heart and portrays more terrible images there. So this is an interesting one too. The narrator is talking about, the convict is not telling him anything. He's only seeing things. And so the narrator's imagining, he's using his fancy, which means, think of fancy as created from an imagination rather than real life. So he's creating certain images and understandings of this convict that he's admitting are not necessarily based on real life. It's based on his own fancy. And that, I think, is important to this, is that, he's not necessarily claiming, I don't think he's necessarily claiming that, again, that he's a lawyer and that we should, that we should just do exactly what this poet says. He's not a lawyer. He's stressing here that he's a poet, and he's trying to pierce the heart with his imagination of this sorrowful creature that nobody cares about, nobody looks at, nobody pities. He's an outcast of pity. To sorrow enough on that visage to gaze, that body dismissed from his care. So there's the visage, his face of the convict, to gaze on him. Again, instead of gawking and pointing at him, he's noticing, and he's using, he's not going to laugh and point and do, ha, look at this gross creature. He's going to use his fancy to pierce the heart of the convict. His bones are consumed, and his lifeblood is dried, with wishes the past to undo, and his crime through the pains that o'erwhelm him descried still blackens and grows on his view. So he's kind of, the convict is tortured by two things. His body is being crushed and, fettered to death. Fettered, by the way, in case you're unaware, means shackles. They're the manacles, the cuffs that hold him down. So that's a fetter. And so they're holding him down, and his bones are consumed, and his lifeblood is dried, with wishes the past to undo. So, he's being punished in the body, and his crime through the pains that overwhelm him, he sees still blackens and grows on his view. So his crime, is imposing on him, and his bones are being crushed as well. So it's a physical and a mental, mind and body. Now, it may be important to note that this is still, we're talking about the fancy of the narrator. So whether this is really what the person is believing, we don't know, and we probably never will know. This is what a poet is trying to do, though, is get into the soul. That's the goal of a poet in this sense, is to use his imaginative faculty to understand the inner life of this person, something that you cannot do. Nobody can look in the inner life of somebody, but what Wordsworth can do is he can use his imagination, his fancy, and he can conjure up based on what he sees and what he maybe can put himself in that sense, and as a criminal, go into the world of this person and show what it would look like and what it feels like, even though the convict is not telling him what he feels like. So in this stanza, his bones are consumed. His lifeblood is, so he's being, the life is being sucked from him because of the wishes, because of the past that he cannot undo. And then the crime itself that he did commit. So this poem is not saying he's innocent, which I think is important. It's not about a innocent convict who's in, like the life of David Gale, where we're trying to get this person out for something he clearly didn't do, or we don't think he did. It's important that you understand that this person did whatever crime he is accused of doing. Okay, next stanza. When from the dark synod or bleak blood-reeking field, To his chamber the monarch is led. So now we have this monarch that is kind of representative, kingly person who's kind of representative of both the synod, the dark council of church, but he's also, this blood reeking field is kind of an accusation. So it's a dark synod and a blood reeking field this monarch is in charge of, and he's kind of also in charge of this criminal, this convict. And so there's an indictment, this soft virtue shall yield, right? So all soothers of sense, their soft virtue shall yield, and quietness pillow his head. So this guy, this stanza is not about the convict, it's about this monarch who's both represents kind of the evils of the church and the evils of the state. So that, at this time when he's writing this is during the war against France, which Wordsworth does not agree with. And it's also, indicative of the idea, like the war of, against America and the colonial, the colonies and all the wars that they're going to. And this person who's killing thousands of people, the blood reeking field, and he's manipulating and tricking and doing all kinds of nasty things via the church. This monarch is somehow, sleeping soundly, and he has quietness pillowed his head, right? He's sleeping soundly, even though all his virtue is soft virtue at best, and he's able to soothe his senses. And so the question it brings up is, why is this person better than the convict? I mean, this person is responsible for thousands of deaths, maybe, over the course of history, millions of deaths. So why is what he is doing acceptable and what the convict did not acceptable? Now, this, I think, is one of the key reasons why Wordsworth did remove this poem from the later versions. It only saw light of day in the 1798 version, which, by the way, were published anonymously, but he got rid of it later. And it might have been too political for him, because that is quite the indictment to the state, to say that, everything, all the killing that is done in the name of the state is wrong. And so that's, whether you agree with that or not, it doesn't matter. That we're trying to understand Wordsworth here and what he's trying to say in this poem. Okay, now the next stanza. But if grief self-contained, self-consumed, in oblivion would doze, and conscience her tortures appease, mid tumult and uproar this man must repose in the comfortless vault of disease. So this is kind of the contrast to the monarch, I think, is that the convict is comfortless, even though he probably only committed 1 or 2 crimes, let's say. The convict has to repose, which is rest, but it's also rest with the meaning of repose is rest with the purpose of getting better, right? It's kind of a restful, it's relaxing, kind of repose that makes, that heals. That's the kind of feeling that repose brings up, the connotations of it. And the monarch, whose blood reeking fields, he's able to soothe with whatever pleasures and have his quiet, nice, comfortable sleep. This convict can't, because he's filled with grief, and his conscience is tortured by his past deeds, and all around him is tumult, right? And he has to live in this vault of disease. That's what Wordsworth is claiming, and it, which is a great turn of phrase when it comes to a jail cell, to call it a vault of disease. Like, it locks in disease. And if you read The Dungeon in Foster Mother's Tale by Coleridge, one of the focuses he has is that, well, if we want to reform these people, why would we put them in something that is like we want to cure somebody, and so what we do is we put them with all the people who are going to get them even more sick, right? Rather than try to isolate them and cure them, we're basically throwing more diseases on them. And that's, so we're putting them in this infestation place where and not only that, but it's like, let's say you have a diseased plant, right? Like your plant has some little spots on it. The solution is not to stop watering it, put it in the basement in the darkest corner you could find, suffocate it with a piece of plastic, and that's somehow going to make the disease go away. Clearly, that's not going to work. And so this vault of disease is not going to help this convict. It's not going to help any convict. So the question is, if you're going to put them in this kind of vault of disease where there's no improvement possible, why not just kill them? Now, he doesn't say that, but that's an implication, I think. Why not just put him out of his misery then? Because you're not giving him a chance to reform. It's not possible to reform, just like the plant can't grow if you put it in the darkest corners of the dungeon. So man can't grow if he's not in that place that we talked about in the first stanza, where he's out with the meadows and the woods and the restful season. He needs to be out in nature in a more calm place if he's even going to have a chance to reform. That's the argument right there. That's a big part of the argument, is that if we're going to reform these people, we have to give them a chance. And we're not giving them a chance if we just kind of stuff them and we, in this corner and make it impossible for them to grow. By the way, if you want a great example of this, read Les Miserables by Victor Hugo and Jean Valjean. I mean, there's no way Jean Valjean could have reformed in the prison system. The reform had to happen when he was finally released after 19 years. But in the hard labor, the tortured grounds, and it's described, where he's like in these cages and people are walking, he's like in a cage and people are walking by pointing and laughing at him. And, so it's emphasized his, the disease element, the vault of disease that Jean Valjean is in. There's no way that he can reform in the prison. It's just not possible because it's more disease there. It's just diseasing his soul. And, the Romantics and Wordsworth and Coleridge believed that a person could reform, but you had to give them the right atmosphere, the right environment. And there's a lot of psychological evidence today that proves that this is true. When his fetters at night have so pressed on his limbs that the weight can no longer be borne, if, while a half slumber his memory bedims, the wretch on his pallet should turn. So this stanza and the next stanza kind of go together. You'll notice that the end of the stanza, unlike almost all stanzas in poetry, doesn't end with a period. It ends with a comma. So the wretch on his pallet should turn, while the jail mastiff howls at the dull clinking chain. From the roots of his hair there shall start 1,000 sharp punctures of cold sweating pain, and terror shall leap at his heart. So we have two contrasts so far. We have the narrator who was just out in the calm season, kind of hanging out in the meadows in the woods, and he comes into this jail cell. And we have this monarch too. This monarch who represents the ecclesiastic, the church, the evils of the church in particular. It's a dark synod, right? Manipulation, taxing, forcing, terrifying with images of hell. And we have the state, the king, and all the machinations of the state that are infusing or creators of blood-reeking fields. And they are in contrast to this person who committed a crime or two or whatever he did, and he's weighed down by fetters that press on his limb, that the weight he can't be borne. So he can't bear it anymore. He's, Jesus on the cross type thing. It's bearing down on him, but he's lost the strength to do anymore. And he has a half slumber. In his half slumber, his memory is dying, and he's just a wretch, a pile of goo on his little pallet. And there's this image of this jail mastiff, like a dog that's howling at the dull clinking chain, that the sounds of the vault of disease or the prison, from the roots of his hair, and the convict's hair, he really from the roots of his hair, but just from his whole body. Imagine him 1,000 sharp punctures of cold sweating pain, right? So he's bursts into cold sweat, and he's terrified, right? Terror infuses his whole body now and his mind. But now he half raises his deep sunken eye, and the motion unsettles a tear in the narrator. The silence of sorrow it seems to supply, and asks of me why I am here. Now remember, this is in the fancy of the narrator, the imagination. So the prisoner never asks anything. He just kind of looks up in a drunken stupor. So this is all assumed by the narrator. That's an important part of the poem to consider, that. And it's, you can disagree with him, and you could even say, yeah, but you got it wrong. He's actually just a criminal piece of crap. He should just be killed. And that's it. And that could be your belief. But then I think you're missing what Wordsworth is trying to accomplish with the poem. And silence of sorrow it seems to supply, and ask of me why I'm here. So he believes that the unsettled eye that's looking at him is asking him, what are you doing here? Here's what the narrator says. And the rest of the poem, the last two stanzas, are in quotations. Poor victim, no idle intruder has stood with overweening complacence our state to compare. So nobody has stood around looking, for their own pleasure and their own goodness, and compared their state to the convict state. That's what he's saying. No idle intruder has stood with overweening complacence our state to compare us, but one whose first wish is the wish to be good is come as a brother thy sorrows to share. But one, so no idle intruder has done this but me, but one. And my first wish is the wish to be good. And I've come as a brother thy sorrow to share my sorrows with you, like a good Christian brother. At thy name, at your name, through compassion her nature resign. Though in virtue's proud mouth your report be a stain, though in virtue's proud mouth your report be a stain. So, his report of the convict is kind of a stain on the virtue of the society and on the person who's standing there, I think. My care, if the arm of the mighty were mine, would plant you where yet you might blossom again. So now we have that garden imagery, and the imagery of trying to, taking seriously the mind and body of a human and what it's necessary for a human in order to survive and flourish. And that if we're going to reform these guys, we have to take into consideration that they need to be treated a certain way. And the narrator is saying, if I had the power, the mighty were mine, if the arm of the mighty were mine, if I were king and ruler, I would plant you. Notice the plant analogy, where you might blossom. And again, where you might blossom, and he doesn't say where you will blossom. He chose his words carefully. Where you might blossom. You have the chance of blossoming. And that's the key question here. If we're going to be in a society where we're going to have, we need the penal system, we need justice, we need all of this in order for all the things I said at the beginning. But the question then becomes, well, are we going to give people a chance to reform? And if we are, then shouldn't we help them, the best of our abilities, obviously without bankrupting ourselves, but shouldn't we help them reform if we're going to do that, if it's possible? So if we don't think reform is even possible, then it just makes the most sense to throw them in a dungeon until they die and spend as little money as possible on them just to make sure they don't escape. And that's it. And, but I think there's problems with that. And I think there's proof that people can reform, right? So that's the point, is that there is the chance of reform. So if there's a chance of reform, we should do our best within the limits of, the money that we can spend on this to make that person a good person in society again, so that they're, welcome and able to live in harmony with the rest of us. And that's part of the argument that Wordsworth is making. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the Troubadour podcast today. And like I said, make sure to check out The Dungeon and the Foster Mother's Tale if you're interested in this idea of the penal system and reform. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.